Back. I'm here with Cole Napper. Cole, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Al. How are you doing?
I'm doing real well. Very excited to be talking with you. You just turned into an author overnight. You have four fantastic articles on LinkedIn, and you have this narrative around what people analytics leaders need to be thinking about, particularly as they start up. So, before we get into the articles, can you just share a little bit about you and how you got into this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I studied IO psychology, PhD program at Louisiana Tech. I really kind of got into people analytics in sort of a roundabout way. I had started in the selection space and then moved into workforce planning, which I think I touched on this in one of the articles. I really latched onto strategic workforce planning. I think it's a really cool and novel concept, and you get into those projections out into the future and using things like forecasting and predictive analytics. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And that was right when people analytics was starting to become a thing. And so I was able to kind of matriculate from strategic workforce planning into people analytics. And ever since I've been there, that's just what I've been kind of riding the wave of what's been going on.
Well, let's then, given your, because I want to talk about the connection between people analytics and workforce planning in a
Sure.
minute. But before we do that, your articles are very well thought through. And you
Thank you.
obviously have a passion, not only your ability to do it, but you have a passion to communicate outward some leading practices or ideas that you have. So, what's your inspiration for doing that?
Honestly, I've been thinking about it for years.
Hmm.
I've seen plenty of people in the field who I very much admire, and seeing kind of how, like, that's actually one of the things I love about people analytics is there's so many people that just kind of give back to the field without, without like asking for any kind of recompensation for it. And so I was like, I've had that kind of as a motivation for a while. But the other thing is, like, I read lots of different sources from different individuals, and I've been trying to kind of come up with, because I don't see it out there as like a unifying theory of people analytics, and to kind of put the Cole Napper stamp on what that is. And so, starting people analytics at a few organizations, I'm always, you're kind of digging yourself out of a hole of like, okay, I got to bring everyone up to speed on how do we do this and how do we do it well. And I was like, I should just write this down. Like, why not? And so it honestly, it started out, I was just going to write one quick article, and then one became two, and two became four, and four actually became six because there's two more that have come out since I think you and I last spoke. So there's quite a bit of detail out there. And then I've actually got a second series of articles that I'm working on now, six more. I'm calling people analytics primers, just to dig into kind of more detailed analytics techniques. Because another thing, and I've heard other people say this before, is that there's a lot of strategy content out there. There's not a lot of tactical, technical, how do you do this work out there. And other than if you like pay for like data camp or something like that. And so I want to contribute to the field in that way as well.
Well, it's definitely needed, and thank you, given my perspective and as a representative of the people in this community for doing this. Because you're right, it's call it open source, call it whatever
Mhm.
you want. Is if we do this sharing, then we're all going to get better at it. And I think about a conversation I had with Ian O'Keefe, who is at Chase at the time, but now he's at Amazon Web Services, who was saying, if somebody in our field really screws this up and it's front page New York Times, that's going to affect all of us. So
Yeah,
we need to share leading practice. We need to share some of the concerns and constraints that will, fall under. Um, this is what I want to talk about right now.
sure.
And, if I might toggle a little bit, because yes, we have some constraints that we need to be thinking about, but we also have some great opportunity. And obviously we have COVID, we have disruptions with the war in Ukraine, gas prices, all these things. So when we talk about strategic workforce planning,
Hmm.
historically, it's been around talent acquisition, primarily. But I know in one of your articles, I think it was the first one about dashboards, is
Hmm.
that you have this acknowledgement that we are analyzing a dynamic workforce. In other
Hmm.
words, doing so over time. So
Yeah.
can you speak to how you define workforce planning and how we need to be accommodating or thinking about the element of time over time?
It's a really interesting concept. And I think in that article that you referenced, I mentioned of how understudied the concept of time is in pretty much any scientific endeavor, not just people analytics or strategic workforce planning. And I actually credit that insight to a colleague of mine that I worked with at TCU, Abby Ship. She's an excellent leader in the field, and she talks a lot about temporal effects. But the way I've kind of come to it is two fronts. One is the strategic workforce planning front, which I'll talk about in a second. But the other is just this concept of cause and effect. Most of the time, you need a time series to determine if you know what you did worked, right? I think in one of the articles I talked about this kind of premise, and I've made a whole career around it, is like, how do you know what you're doing is working? Well, if you don't track something over time, it's very difficult to prove that what you're doing is working. And so in the strategic workforce planning context, I've seen plenty of strategic workforce plans that were put out there, 1 year, 3 years, 5 years into the future. And then nobody follows up to ever check, a year, 3 years, 5 years into the future, if that plan was even accurate. And so I think it's kind of this concept of backwards compatibility. You have to know what's the delta between what you projected and what actually happened. And I think that's where all the nuance and the goodness and the learning, like we talk a lot about machine learning nowadays. What about actual learning? Like, how do we calibrate our models to show and correct those models to say, hey, we've gotten better, or here's the gap that we've seen, and here are how we're going to improve it going forward. And so I think about strategic workforce planning. And you mentioned like the war in Ukraine and many other like just COVID related kind of second and third order effects of what have happened from COVID and how that's affected the world. Many of those things would be incredibly difficult to predict and plan around if you were wound the clock 5 years ago, right? I mean, who would have projected a global pandemic as a part of their strategic workforce planning session? I think that's a lot to ask of someone, right? And I think it's a lot to ask of any kind of strategy function at an organization. And I think that's why many organizations had to quickly pivot when the pandemic occurred, just to stay relevant. And I would even I'll credit Booster, my current employer. Well, before the pandemic, Booster I was actually a customer of Boosters in the past. That's why I love them so much. What they used to do is they used to fuel the location. Like, you would go into a big employer, they would come to the parking lot, and as an employee benefit, they would fuel your car while you were in the office. It was like, I used to call it like little like chipmunks that would come out and fuel your car, and it was amazing. You would just show up and your car would be filled up with gas. Well, after the pandemic, everybody started working from home, right? Well, immediately we pivoted to large fleets. So, we have some very brand name customers that are out there that are global organizations that are very desirable. And now what we do is almost 100% fleet based at the moment. We're pivoting into other areas. And we've even moved into renewable fuels. I almost got 100% renewable fuels just to be good stewards of the environment. So it's a pretty incredible organization. But you can see how, from a strategic workforce planning standpoint, we needed to completely wholesale change our workforce. One major shift was literally shifts. We used to be a day shift company, and now we're a night shift company. We've pivoted back into the day shift more recently, but you can imagine the different labor pools that are available to you depending on the shifts that your organization takes.
Yeah. I'm going to highlight this article that you wrote and to stage it, strategy and implementation. And I want to come to some of the specifics within it in a
Mm-hmm.
minute, but I just want to highlight, and again, you can go to Cole's LinkedIn profile and you can see all 4 articles, and we'll make sure we put these in the chats. But this is where I want to get to when you talk about
Sure.
workforce planning, strategy, implementation, is we have to be working on the right things at the right
Yes.
times. And you're talking about people analytics leadership. Now what? So my
Mhm.
question to you is, how do you, as a people analytics leader, prioritize?
It's there's some art and there's some science to it.
Mhm.
Obviously, I talked about in the past, and I can actually pull this up, the operating principles that my team utilizes. Let me share my screen real quick. And they're in order for a reason. right? So we first talk about alignment, which is go slow to go fast, but always do what's right for the business, right? That's really the key step in figuring out how what to prioritize. Now it gets a little bit more difficult when you get to the mantra on the right hand side: do what works and only that, nothing more, nothing less. So in the article, it talks about how that can be related to overproduction and waste, but really, it's actually difficult to know sometimes if what you're going to do is going to work and be the right thing for the business. And so sometimes there is somewhat of a, a moonshot out there of knowing, hey, is what we're doing the right thing, and are we going slow to go fast enough to prioritize? But my rule of thumb is I'm looking at the business and I'm looking at where we're making our strategic investments in terms of what, like, kind of seeing around the corner, what are we needing to do to get us from point A to point B to accomplish our objectives? And then I'm investing my team's time there, right? And then we'll kind of Pareto it, and we'll go down the Pareto curve based on what's, secondarily, tertiarily, and so on and so forth, based on the organizational priorities.
Yeah. So you kind of touched on it right there, and I like to get more clear on it. So when we
Sure.
talk about workforce planning, we talk about
Mhm.
shifting shifts. There are a bunch of decision makers in
Yeah.
that process. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, AKA stakeholders, AKA internal customers. And so, what does the governance model for your work look like? Do you report to the CHRO? Do
Mhm.
you have a steering committee that you report into? If so, who makes that up? At what frequency do you meet? And what does that look like?
That's a really good question. First of all, I'd love to shout out our Chief People Officer, Ron Storm. He has been an excellent leader in this space, and frankly, he's been very encouraging of this line of work. So I think it would be a missed opportunity not to thank him for this opportunity, right? But I do report into our Chief People Officer. That said, our team, I call it being embedded with the business. So we don't have a technical governance committee, but what we do have is we have a direct line to each key executive that we're working with. And I think there's like a feed forward and a feedback from them, and the feedback loops that are associated. So some of the things they're bringing directly to us and saying, hey, we need your help. Other times they're bringing to us kind of their business strategy, and they're saying, how can you help? What ideas can you bring into the fold? And so really it's that feedback and that feed forward of how we determine what are the key priorities of what we're working on directly embedded with the business.
I absolutely love that approach because, number one, governance can be burdensome, yet we need to communicate effectively, and people namely our internal customers, need to feel that you're not in this black box, just
Yeah.
doing stuff. And, when's it going to arrive? What is it? So when you talk about implementation in your strategy and implementation article that I brought up earlier,
Mhm.
can you define how you formulate your strategy and what implementation means and looks like to you?
I think I talk about this. It's where, be world class where you need to be world class and neglect almost everything else, right? And keep in mind those articles were targeted at a new people analytics leader. Now,
Mhm.
obviously, if you're working at a mature organization and you've had years under your belt, you're probably going to want to be world class at many things, right? But in the beginning, you're going to have to choose where can you be world class, and then neglecting almost everything else. And so if the organization at the time is needing operational workforce planning, but they're probably not needing as much, maybe employee surveys, for instance, go all in on workforce planning and don't even try to do surveys yet, right? And so you bring up the 2x2 chart here. This is meant to be somewhat comical, but I think it's also just really important, right? Is that if you look at the time and effort that something is taking versus the value it brings to the organization, obviously you're probably going to have things in all four quadrants. I don't want to come across as, the perfect human being that has never made a mistake in their life. But the reality is, I think a lot of times people analytics leaders want to go for the high quadrant. You can only afford to do a few of those. The low quadrant, that's most of our day jobs, whether we'd like to admit it. The high low quadrant, this is the sweet spot. These are the things that maybe you can make a quick 3-year plan from a workforce planning standpoint, and that can make a quick splash and help a decision be made tomorrow, right? Now, maybe you might not have all the rigor and the science behind what you're needing to do, but guess what? You're moving at the speed of the business. So that's a high, low value. And that would be a great example of how a people analytics leader can make an impact quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I was a fan of you before, but I'm becoming a more of a fan of you as we go because, and we talked about this leading up. I mean, I want to, you're a straight shooter, and not to imply that other people in the field aren't, but you have a very fundamental, practical way of looking at things and getting things done. And so, do you feel that as a discipline, when we look at all the tools and analytical techniques out there, that we're getting sometimes a bit lost in the analytical gloss as opposed to just delivering the value that the business needs?
And I think it's important to have balance, right?
Mhm,
When
mhm,
I look at the field, one of the things I admire about the field is how much we look in the mirror, right?
mhm,
We look at
mhm,
ourselves, we say, "Oh, this is cool, this is interesting," or "This is what you shouldn't be doing," right? This
mhm,
is not, this is a no-go zone. And I really appreciate about the field. What sometimes is missing though is kind of that two-way mirror of seeing through the other side and
mhm,
saying, what's the feed forward into how what we're doing is making an impact on the business, not just kind of the, I don't know, call it like the analytics arms race where we're all just trying to become world class at everything, even if our business doesn't need it, right?
Yep.
And so I think it's just really important to apply what you're doing to the right problem with the right veracity that's necessary to fix it. I think as a field, and I'll because I lump in not just with the field, like the people that are practitioners like myself, or the consultants, or the vendors, because I think we all need each other. We're an ecosystem that makes this thing happen together. And what I would love to see, especially on the vendor front, is vendors coming in and showing how they tackle problems directly for the business, not just, augmenting the, like I see like these ROI pitches. And sometimes it's like, well, this is going to make you have the equivalent, instead of one analyst, you'll have 4 analysts. And it's like, well, the business didn't care that much about how many analysts we had. They care a lot about the value that they're seeing from our work.
I'm pausing for this reason is that we have this opportunity to do great things
Mm-hmm.
in this field.
Yeah.
We also have arguably, at least not for me, arguably, but I'll just say it,
Sure.
a responsibility to do
Yes.
good work
Mhm.
because we're affecting, people's lives. So how do you feel about our responsibility to be proactive, to be creative, to manage this ecosystem in a very thoughtful, proactive way?
Oh yeah, what I'm saying, I hope it doesn't ever come across as diminishing the value we bring or the creativity.
Mm,
Like I would love to say, I would love to think, and I actually have evidence for this, that some of the most impactful work I've done in my career, nobody asked about, nobody thought about, right? It
mm,
was that it was taking, myself or members of my team working directly with the business and saying, hey, here's something you might not have considered. And we're going to do something that, I don't know for a fact because, different companies do different things. They don't necessarily publicize it. But this may have never been done before in the history of people analytics. And it's going to make an impact. And then, of course, this is where the time value comes in. Wait 6 months, wait a year, and we'll prove to you with the ROI numbers that this made an impact. And sometimes people kind of throw up their hands and they say, not interested. And other times, they're on board. And this is again, that's why I have the fourth operating principle of my team is credibility. How do you establish, maintain, and never lose the credibility of the function? Always measure twice, cut once. Credibility lost is never regained, right? These are really, really important concepts. And you see it on here. The past teams will be laughing at this because I've hounded on it so many times. It's just really, really important to not just be a thought leader, but to hold ourselves accountable as much as we hold our partners in the business accountable.
The idea that we do this in a vacuum, as we alluded to earlier,
Mhm.
needs to go away.
Yeah.
I want to highlight what you just shared around the creative aspect, because not to get too uh, West Coast California, but we're artists, and
Yes.
we have a obligation to create and be thoughtful. Everything from designing survey questions to doing analyses, because there are different analytical techniques that we can apply to a certain problem. Correct me if I'm wrong, and from your perspective. So my question is this: we have to do this creativity and apply this creativity rather, but we have to do it at speed. We have to do it
Mhm.
at scale, and we have to do it a sustainable way. So it's not all reliant on, us sitting in front of a computer, doing stuff. So what's your, feeling? I know your second point operating principle is scalability. So can
Mhm.
you speak to that?
Yeah, it's man, especially with a lot of these organizations, they say they're looking for people analytics, but really they're just looking for someone to pull reports for them, right? And
Mhm.
there's not a lot of artistry in that. I'll tell you that. And so the key coming in, as I see it, is instead of trying to be the person who pulls 100 different reports for 100 people, why don't we create one report that solves 100 people's problem, right? And I think it doesn't require much more explanation than that, because that math problem can get inverted really quickly and the capacity of the team can evaporate, right? But on the creativity side, I actually kind of step back here for a second and touch. That's actually one of the reasons why I wrote these articles. I was actually kind of nervous at first. I don't know. I just never done this before, so I was pretty nervous. But after publishing it, like I had this newly found invigoration because I was able to use my creative juices, and to really, share something with the community. And that happens in the work sometimes,
Mhm.
right? I mean, not every project is obviously the most intellectually stimulating thing you ever worked on. But sometimes when you can truly do something, it's like you're bringing about creation that may have not existed. That is the artistry. That is the thing where passion comes in. And then if you can take that and make it scalable, it's even that much more dangerous, right? I mean, it's like like a magical experience, and I think that's what it makes this field so interesting and fun.
Well, let's talk about that as we start to, wrap. And by the way, if you're listening and watching, if you have questions, just enter them in the chat, and we'll, field them as they come in. But my question is this creativity, and you're inspiring me right now. I'm getting all fired up. And so your team, your last article was around, building a team, and I imagine you
Mhm.
want a similar, or people with similar passion and enthusiasm and creativity. That being said, there's certain linear things like reports that need to be generated.
Sure.
And so what are the key attributes that you look for in building a team?
The first, what I guess I don't even look for, like, I don't even consciously look for this, but I do look for passion and intrinsic interest in the field. But beyond that, I look for critical and analytical thinking.
Hmm.
So what I like to do is I like to throw out like once we've gotten past like behavioral based questions, because I don't just like to advocate for science for others. I like to eat my own dog food, as you will. But once you're getting past that part of the process and getting into how would you creatively tackle this problem, like, and I want to get like walk through their thought process and thinking about, okay, what's a different way of looking at this that maybe other people might not have imagined. And if someone comes to me and it sounds like they just read it in a book and they're just repeating it back to me, like what I do not look for and I have a strong aversion to is just recall, right?
Hmm.
Someone
Hmm.
reiterates what someone else said, but they don't understand it from a deep philosophical understanding. That's not critical and analytical thinking. And I mean, obviously, I want someone who's got the skills, but I feel like from a leadership perspective, I can teach the skills.
Hmm.
I am so committed to people on my team's development. Like if they don't have everything today, that's no big deal at all. We're going to learn a lot just by doing our jobs. The 70-20-10 model of development, we're going to get plenty of that 70% all of the time. I I hate to say like throwing people into the deep end because that has a negative connotation, but it's fun. It's empowerment. It's autonomy. I
Hmm.
want to give people big jobs that they can grow into, right? And that's not being thrown into the deep end. That's an investment in your career.
Man, I want to work for you. I don't know if you'd hire me, but that
I was
I just
hoping you
want
would hire me, Al.
I want to highlight this point, and not only is it creativity, it is curiosity. It
Yes.
is, asking questions.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, I'm asked to come in, oh, tell me how to tell stories with data, and I come
Mhm.
back and say, well, what stories are appropriate? What stories will actually be helpful? Because the stories that are in the data are constrained by the data. It
Yeah.
might be the case where we need to go and create new data or acquire new data to tell a story beyond what we are able to at that point in time. And that takes this going out and soliciting, if you will, our internal customers to understand how they think so we
Yeah.
can meet their narrative where they are. That's how I approach it. Do you see this kind of growth mindset, this
Mhm.
nature of inquiry being critical to how you operate and how you want your
Oh,
team to operate?
I cannot give people like it was one of the things that I think you see in these articles that I've written is I try to give a lot of people a lot of credit.
Yeah,
And
you
I
do.
give, Alec Levinson and Alexis Fink, they had a series, I think it was probably a year ago now, where they talked about people analytics and the nexus point between it and org development.
Mhm.
And that org development is that going out into the business. It's going and understanding what people need and kind of helping them from a consulting mindset, right? And
Mhm.
so I remember I was interviewing, this was a few companies ago, with a chief people officer to get a job. And I guess they didn't know very much about people analytics. And so they asked me a kind of like a technical question of like, how would you approach the situation? And I first talked about how much time I would like, go see, go do from like a kimchi gimbutsu. I used to work at Toyota, so like the manufacturing context of going out and seeing the work being done, and then meeting with stakeholders, meeting with leaders, trying to understand the organizational context. And she said to me, she's like, "Cole, that sounds like you're just an OD professional. Why that doesn't have anything to do with analytics?" And I said, "Well, I suppose I could just sit behind a computer all day crunching numbers, but if that didn't help anybody and didn't solve any problems, I'm not doing my job." And I ended up getting the job, so I guess it worked.
Well, I absolutely love it, Cole. We're going to have to talk more again because you have a lot to say, and it's certainly worth listening to and considering and learning from. As we start to wrap, I want to go back to what we touched on at the beginning. Your connection, your view, and the connection between workforce planning and people analytics.
Mhm.
Is it one and the same to you? And what are the key outcomes? What are the decisions that are made from each of those? I know that's a big question as we start to wrap, but
Sure.
what's your
I
feel?
think the easy answer is kind of like it's a it's two circles. There are aspects. It's like a Venn diagram. There are aspects of strategic workforce planning that have nothing to do with people analytics. There are things in people analytics that have nothing to do with strategic workforce planning. But I would say if you had to proportionally weight those bubbles, the strategic workforce planning bubble is smaller and the people analytics bubble is huge because
Mm.
we cover everything. And that's why I love the transition of the name from the being HR analytics to people analytics, is
Mhm.
because we span everything that people touch in the organization. And that's what makes that bubble so huge.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said, and we're gonna have to come back to your
Let's do
workforce
it, man.
planning
I'm
because
down.
I'm just your energy again is contagious, and your insights and ideas that you're presenting not only here today but in your articles
Yeah.
is top notch. So thank you for doing what you do. How can people learn more about you and what you're up to there at Booster?
Yeah, well, so stay in touch with me on LinkedIn. I've got all the articles that I have posted and that I will be posting on my Medium website. And then also, and I've been working with you, Al. I want to give you a big thank you here about upcoming DFW People Analytics meetups that we're going to be coordinating. I don't think we have any firm dates yet, but we've got two coming up. And so I would love to meet anybody in the area in person as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You can learn more about what we're doing there at PAFOW.net. You can see the dates, and we'll be setting that up here, hopefully by the end of this week. But again, Cole, thanks for doing what you do. Thanks for contributing to the space so generously. And yes, we will see one another in person next month. So super excited
Absolutely.
about that. All right.
Awesome. Thank you
You be
so much
well.
for the opportunity, Al.
Absolutely. Cheers, my friend.
See you.
Bye-bye.